Hello and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. I'm Virginia Prescott, host of GPB's On Second Thought and your host for these talks. Tonight I'm talking with Dr. Katherine Landdeck about her new book, The Women with Silver Wings, the inspiring true story of the women Air Force service pilots of World War II. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books. It's worth it just for the photographs, and it's a fantastic story as well. There's a link to purchase the book in the chat to the right of your screen, and there's also a link provided on the Atlanta History Center website. As Katherine and I are talking, we do invite you to please submit your questions. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I'm going to try and integrate as many of them into the conversation as time will allow, so please do send them. Katherine Sharp Landdeck is Associate Professor of History at Texas Women's University and a Guggenheim Fellow at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Her work has been published in the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and in academic and aviation publications. She is also an exuberant licensed pilot. And Katherine, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Okay, so let's start way back. Even those who've heard of Amelia Earhart may be surprised to learn how many women were part of the whole aviation fever taking hold in the US, especially in the 1920s and 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
How did women participate in the air craziness of that time?
Well, I think that's a great question. You know, the women of the 1930s were caught up in, as you said, the air craziness of the time. It really was the golden age of aviation, and women were caught up in it just as much as the men were. You have, Amelia Earhart, obviously, but you have hundreds of other women who are learning to fly. And the thing about aviation at the time is it was so popular. It was in magazines, it was in newspapers. You have, people who are full-time aviation writers because everybody wanted to hear about it. And women were full participants in that enthusiasm.
We learn in your book about a number of women like Cornelia Fort, Teresa James, Helen Ritchie, who
Mm-hmm.
later joined the war effort as civilian pilots. We can't, of course, get to all of them, but are there any particular stories that stick out for you about these early elite women pilots?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the thing about these early women pilots is they really saw something in themselves and believed that they could do it and went for it. And they were often seen as a novelty. Lots of newspaper articles about the girl flyers and this kind of extraordinary view of these women. So they really quite often were put out there as, very symbolic of all women and that sort of thing. So you think of Amelia Earhart and how much newspaper publicity she got and that sort of thing. And you have, on a smaller scale, many of the other women pilots are doing the same thing, whether it's Cornelia Ford or Helen Ritchie was very famous because she was doing all sorts of competitions fitting in with the time of the era where she was, air racing and just doing everything that she could. And Teresa James, of course, was a stunt pilot in air shows and getting in the local newspapers all the time. And they were just really doing everything they could to fly and to promote the idea of women flying.
Mm-hmm. Well, that wasn't such an easy sell for everybody. In fact, Amelia Earhart helped form the 99s, partially to advocate for women pilots. What kind of resistance were they facing from men at that time?
Right. Well, I think there was a lot of competition and a lot of competition for people to support them, right? So you have people who are air racing and they need sponsors. So there's some competition in that way. And there's also a lot of attitude about, can women really do this or not? So part of the reason the 99s formed was to advocate for women and give a chance for those women pilots to have a group of one another to try to get into the air races that often men said, no, women can't be a part of this. It's too dangerous. We have to protect you. And the women said, we can do it.
And they also made the case that they could fly when they were menstruating.
Yes. Yeah, there were rules put into place because nobody was quite sure what women could do, or at least the men weren't quite sure what the women could do, and tried to limit the women from flying when they were pregnant or when they were menstruating or whatever, and the women fought it successfully.
Well, mostly the women who we meet in the book, especially those elite early pilots, had some money and some social status, but not all of them. And that gap is part of the dynamic between two central characters in the book, Nancy Love and Jacqueline Cochran. They
Hmm.
both held leadership positions in what became the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP. So let's start with Nancy. Who was she and how did she get the aviation bug?
Right. Nancy Love was from Michigan, and her father was a doctor. Her mother was from a well-to-do Boston family, and she was initially unimpressed with aviation. She was actually in Paris on a trip with her aunt and saw Charles Lindbergh land. And, where hundreds of thousands of people are watching and so excited. And she's like, no big deal. But then when she was just 15, a barnstormer came to her field where she'd been riding her horse and landed, gave her a ride, and that was it. She was hooked and went on to become a prominent test pilot, and she sold aircraft and did all sorts of really important things in aviation.
Yeah. She was one of the people who demonstrated that to sell planes to women, they had to show that it was so easy, even a woman could do it.
And that helped sell the planes to the men too, because if a woman could do it, surely the men could.
So she marries actually Robert Love. He is one of the, if I tell me if I have this right, the owners of this company that she's working for, Intercity Aviation.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
But we also have Jacqueline Cochran. She's from much more humble beginnings, but a true dynamo. And she was a close friend of Amelia Earhart, in fact. Let's have a little on her and how she became such a celebrated pilot.
Right. Jackie Cochran is one of those characters in the past that, people say, who would you like to sit down to dinner with if you could? And Jackie's on my list because you just never know what you're going to get from her. But yes, she grew up poor in Florida and Alabama. Her father was a sawmill operator. And, she decided to escape the poverty and learned how to be a hairdresser after working in the factories. It's from the time she was a very young child, about 8 years old was the last she had school. And she became a good hairdresser and decided to flee to New York. Reinvented herself completely, made up that her family, she was an orphan, and made it all up, but just was very smart and very ambitious, and ended up marrying one of the wealthiest men in the world, and was able to start her own cosmetics company and learn how to fly and became very good, very fast. Was one of the best air racing pilots in the world.
So, what did that mean being an air racing pilot at that time? What would you do?
Well, that's a good question. So air racing was a very popular sport at the time. It was more popular than football, college football, and college baseball. More people went to the air shows and would watch the stunt pilots. And then the air racing was a competition where they had long distance cross country air races where pilots would take off and be timed. They also had pylon races where you'd have, two ends and the pilots would race around them and race like you'd race around a race track, only do it in the air. And Jackie did those long distance flights more than anything else and was quite good and literally one of the best pilots in the world.
So you have this kind of dynamic, ambitious, outspoken, as it turns out, Jackie Cochran, and you have Nancy Love, who's much more cool-headed, much more
Hmm.
personable. And early on, there's a power play between the two of them and their respective supporters in the military brass that reverberates pretty much throughout the book. But both were making the case for women pilots to do work that would free up male pilots during the war. So, briefly, how do their approaches differ?
Right, you're quite right that they both had the same idea, right? They both wanted women to serve, but they both thought that women could help with the war effort. They were both very patriotic, very ambitious, and competitive. So Nancy had the idea of taking very well qualified women pilots with, hundreds of hours of flight experience, 200 horsepower rating, meaning a bigger, heavier aircraft that they could fly, and bringing them directly into the ferrying command of the Army Air Forces. And just a small group, 25 women, maybe 50 women at the most, who would step right in and become ferry pilots right alongside the men. Jackie was a little more ambitious in her plans. She said, yes, let's do that, but then let's see what else women can do. There are thousands of women out there who want to fly, several thousand who already have some flight time. Let's bring them into the Army Air Forces. Let's give them a little more flight experience, give them some more training, and then let's see what else they can do to release men for other duties. So we have all these planes that are being built. You think of Rosie the Riveter and the hundreds of thousands of planes we're building over time during the war. They all have to be flown from place to place. They all have to be test flown. You've got pilots that need to be taught how to fly, all of these different things. And Jackie's idea was, let's have women do these different jobs so they can send men overseas and leave those domestic duties for the women.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain what ferrying means?
Sure. So ferrying is just basically that idea of flying an airplane from, in this case, an airplane from the factory where it's been created to the points of embarkation. So they'd fly them to the East Coast to go, we put on a ship to go overseas to the war in Europe, or they'd be flown to the West Coast to be put on a ship to be flown overseas to the Pacific. And so you've got factories that are in Dallas and Detroit and New Jersey, and those planes being built in those places. Los Angeles was a big place as well, that need to get to both coasts. So you need pilots to fly them there. And so that's what the ferry pilots did.
Mm-hmm. If you do have questions for Katherine Landdeck, please put them in the Q&A section of the chat. I'm going to get to the question that's up there in just a couple minutes because we're leading pretty much right there. Okay, so early on there's this power play between the two. How did that get resolved? Like one of them wanted to go, these elite pilots, straight to the ferrying. The other, Jackie, wanted to train pilots for all manner of things. How did that get worked out?
Well, I think the General Henry Hap Arnold was the head of the Army Air Forces, and both women's proposals had been brought to him. And initially he said, no, we're not having women pilots. We don't need them. But by September of 1942, they decided, okay, we're desperate. We need, we're desperate enough for pilots that we'll try it with the women. And so you really have this idea of one woman's program. But the ferry pilots started. Nancy started those ferry pilots. They were called the WAFs, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. And at the same time, Jackie started the trainees, and she started them in Houston, and then they moved up to Sweetwater, Texas, which is just west of Abilene, if anybody knows where Abilene, Texas is, just west of Fort Worth by a couple hours. And the idea was that the women that were trained in Jackie's program would just move very seamlessly into the ferrying program. So it was one program, but with two different parts that worked together very nicely.
So there was some resistance from the Army, but they had some really interesting and important and influential advocates, one of them being Eleanor Roosevelt. What role did she serve in this program?
Yeah, well, Eleanor Roosevelt was a huge advocate for women in aviation. She was friends with Amelia Earhart, wanted desperately to learn how to fly herself, and Franklin wouldn't let her. So Jackie had written to Eleanor Roosevelt. She'd gotten to meet her on a number of occasions when she'd won some awards for her flying, and Jackie wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt and said, let's try the women. And so Eleanor Roosevelt actually wrote in her My Day column, women pilots are waiting to be used. Let's utilize them as much as possible, and really tried to push forward.
Question here from Christine said, many years ago, I lived in Nome, Alaska, and was told that during the war, women were flying the planes up to Nome, and then Russian pilots would pick them up from there. Is that true?
Well, they would fly. The women weren't allowed to go all the way to Alaska, but the planes that the women had flown were picked up there. So we've got pictures of some of the women flying planes that have Russian symbols on them, because so many of the planes that went to Russia were part of our Lend-Lease program. So the women would fly them out west, and then male pilots would take them up across Canada to Alaska, and then they would be taken from the Soviet women would take them, or Soviet pilots would take them.
Huh. So, all right. So we have, there's a member of the military who says, I've been combing the woods for pilots, and there they are right under my nose.
That's
Women
right. That's
pilots.
right.
So in 1942, this program does begin. FDR at that point, after Pearl Harbor, had ordered tens of thousands of planes to be rolling off the factory floors. About 60,000 in 1942, even
Mhm.
more, 100,000 in 1943. So this program begins. It soon is expanded to about 70 bases and this training center in Sweetwater, Texas, that you mentioned. So, what kind of obstacles did women have to overcome as pilots on bases and on the training facilities that were really built for men?
Mhm. Well, there's all sorts of challenges, in the training, especially. They had the struggle with the fact that they didn't have any clothes for the women, nothing that really fit. So when they got their graduation uniform, the women went to Oshman Sporting Goods and bought tan pants to wear for their own graduation and supplied their own white shirts. And then when they were in training, they got big mechanics coveralls to wear over their clothes while they were training. And they were big and baggy and size 44 and up for a lot of these very small women. So, they had some real challenges in just the gear that they got. Some of their parachutes didn't fit right. It was just a real challenge.
Hmm. So we have this program. They got a lot of press, Look magazine. There are newsreels coming in to film these lady pilots. Ultimately, 25,000 women, as you report in the book, were called to serve in what became the WASP.
Hmm.
Women from South Dakota, from Virginia, many of them mothers, a preacher's daughter from the Midwest, or at least one heiress. So, what was the appeal for all of these women who applied to this program?
I think that's a great question. And this is something that Jackie Cochran had said in later years, that 25,000 women applied. And I'll be honest, I always thought Jackie made it up, because Jackie made things up, right? And it's like, oh yeah, Jackie. But I've been to the National Archives and I've seen the boxes full of applications to this program, and some are on thin onion skin paper, some are handwritten, some are very neatly typed, and literally tens of thousands of women applying to this. And then the reality is, people wanted to fly. They loved aviation. These women all came of age during that golden age of aviation. So they were girls and teenagers when Lindbergh was flying and Earhart was flying and even Helen Ritchie was flying. And so they were just, the passion for flying and wanting to be in an airplane was so strong for that whole generation that it was made perfect sense that they would want to do it.
Yeah, I think of how relatively few opportunities a woman, if she didn't have means, would have
Hmm.
to travel outside of her, little town.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this was an opportunity for women to serve their country and to help with the war effort. And one of them wrote to me that she wanted to help with the war effort and she couldn't knit,
Hmm.
so she decided to fly planes. And this was a real chance for them to have an adventure as well and to get to fly planes. And it was something they'd always wanted to do.
A lot of people are keying into this Russian pilot thing. Linda Lee said, I grew up in Great Falls, Montana, which is the home of Malmstrom Air Force Base.
Hmm.
Many women ferried planes in and out of that Air Force Base during the war. I think I remember a story about that actually in
Hmm.
your book. We had Russian soldiers at the Air Force Base there too. And
Hmm.
Carol said, did the Soviet night witches do any of the ferrying of the Russian planes? I don't know who the Soviet night witches are, but you probably do.
Yeah, I do. So the Soviet Union used women as combat pilots. And so there was several groups of women that did that. And the nickname that they've acquired over the years has been the Night Witches, because they did a lot of night flying in their work. I do not have, I don't know if women came and got the planes and carried them back, ferried them back, if the Soviet women did. I think there's no reason that they wouldn't have. That would have been good ferrying experience if they were getting additional training. But I haven't been able to look into the Soviet records to look at that particular detail. The Great Falls, Montana, that's absolutely right. That was a huge stopping point for a lot of these ferry pilots. A lot of them continued to talk about the cold when they were flying some of these planes in the winter.
This gets to a question that Rosita is asking. There's a story of one applicant, at least, Mildred Hemmons Carter.
Mm-hmm,
Stellar credentials. She was educated at Tuskegee, of course, at
mm-hmm,
HBCU. Told in a letter from Cochrane that women's flight training program had no provision for colored girls.
mm-hmm.
Were Black women allowed to participate as pilots, asked Rosita, in any form?
No, nope, they weren't. And that's one of those aspects of this program. There was very limited diversity, racial diversity. There were 2 Chinese American women as a part of the program. There was 1 Native American woman that was a part of the program, but Black women were not allowed. Jackie Cochran's argument was, well, there are a number of things. First, the military was segregated at the time, and so that was a big part of her argument was, the military was segregated. I'm having a hard enough time, this is what she said, I'm having a hard enough time getting women to be able to do these things, let alone a desegregated organization. She also worried that a lot of their bases were in the South and then that would cause problems. And one of the concerns for ferry pilots, because no Black men or women served as ferry pilots that I've been able to find. One of the concerns was the reality that a lot of towns were closed to Black people at the time. You think about the Green Book. I know that's been a popular film, but this idea that you have these sundown cities or sundown towns that didn't allow Black men or women in them after dark. And hotels were segregated and restaurants were segregated. And so this idea of the kind of work that the ferry pilots did, where you land at different places and you never quite know what the weather's going to do, so you have to be able to land everywhere, and it just wasn't fair or right, but it was a huge challenge. So Jackie wrote letters. She interviewed with several of the women who were qualified. I've found at least 6 by name who applied, who were qualified and refused. And Jackie met with several of them and said, I'm sorry, I can't. Go find the Women's Army Corps or the Waves, which is the women who served in the Navy during World War II. But she didn't admit any Black women.
You talking about the unpredictability of when you might have to land reminded me of there was one Chinese American woman, Hazel was her first name. I can't remember.
Hazel Ayung Lee.
Okay. Yeah. So something that happened to her when she was flying unexpectedly.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things, it was on a training flight that Hazel had to land in a farmer's field because of a hailstorm that came up unexpectedly, which they do in Texas especially. And she landed in the farmer's field, and the farmer came out and thought that she was a Japanese pilot that had landed in his field. And, she tells the story later very, hilariously about how she's like, no, I'm Chinese. We're allies. So she was very funny and very well liked in her class of classmates and loved telling that story about the farmer who thought she was Japanese.
The fact that women of color, or Black women at least, were not admitted to the program, it sort of points to what feels like something that was very important to Jackie. The white, and let's say admit cisgendered, her near obsession with her trainees projecting feminine behavior and
Mm-hmm.
propriety. This especially when the training program moves to Sweetwater in West Texas, a dry town out in West Texas. So what kind of rules were there for women?
Right. I think you're quite right. Jackie cared very much about the image of her program. She thought it reflected on her. She also knew that if it got bad press or even controversial press, that it could be canceled very easily. So she definitely wanted the women to appear feminine and to follow the rules. So she had all sorts of rules. They followed the Army's demerit book, even though they were technically civilians. And so, if you played your radio too loud, you could get a demerit. And there was strictly no drinking on base while you were doing that. There was no dating of any of the male instructors that were on the field, though strangely enough, some of the students graduated and then married their instructor. So I don't think that worked very well for her. But it came to be called Cochrane's Convent because her rules were so strict and restricting the male pilots from coming to the base as well.
I promise all of you who are asking about what happened after the war, we will definitely get to that. But in keeping with Jackie's insistence that the WASP were not replacing men, but relieving them so they could go off and fly bombers, she was also fixated on keeping them separate from male pilots as much as possible. Now, Nancy Love, on the other hand, she wants to integrate the WASP into the military. So these are distinct approaches. And this is really highlighted when a bill was introduced to Congress to give WASP military status and benefits. I know it's a complicated part of the story with a lot of players and a lot of agendas, but can you summarize how military status would have benefit the WASP?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important. And Nancy and Jackie both expected the women to be part of the military. They both planned for it kind of in different ways. And it's important to recognize too that the Army Air Forces expected the women to be part of the military. They wanted to give the women a 90-day, kind of trial period and then bring them in properly. And it got all mixed up in politics and all sorts of complications that I do talk about in the book quite extensively. But one of the things, if they had been brought in officially to the military, they would have had insurance for one thing, because when they were killed, and 38 of the women were killed during the war, their families didn't get the gold star in the window, they didn't get a flag on their coffin, and they didn't get insurance. They got the civil service $200 death benefit rather than the $10,000 benefit they would have gotten. And it was just this very strange in-between place that the women found themselves, where they had to follow all the military rules. They could go to the officers' club. They were saluted. They got demerits if they did things wrong, but they didn't get those benefits of the military, including after the war. They didn't get the GI Bill or any of those things. So it was really a very unfortunate in-between that the women found themselves in.
Well, this bill that is introduced and being argued vociferously in Congress results in a real backlash. Male pilots from the War Training Service disagree. So what is their argument against admitting women to the military?
Right. So a number of things kind of come to a head together in 1944. By early 1944, we had figured out how to save more pilots overseas, especially in the war in Europe. The P-51, for the aviation buffs in the crowd, the P-51 had those extended fuel tanks by then and was escorting the B-17s all the way into Europe. The German Luftwaffe was being defeated, so we weren't losing as many pilots. We were bringing more pilots home. And there's a group of civilian pilots that worked for the War Training Service as flight instructors. And in early 1944, both the Army and the Navy said, we no longer need those flight instructors. And so you're going to, after 90 days, you're going to be eligible for the ground army. This is just as, we're realizing we're going to have a land invasion of Japan, all of these things. And so these male pilots who weren't in the military themselves said, now hold on, because it had been a draft deferred position, right? So now they were no longer draft deferred. They said, hold on, we're qualified as pilots. Why are you training all these women, girls is what they called them at the time, right? Why are you training all these women to do the job that we're here and we can do? And it's a big waste of money, and it's unfair. So that was essentially their argument was, we want those jobs, so the girls shouldn't do them.
Yeah, and it was a pretty organized effort. And the press that had been fixated on the patriotism of the WASP shifts to negative stories about these daring lady pilots. So how is this a sign of things to come?
Right. Well, I think the negative press and that shift is really important because it shows, the group that spoke up was the one who was saying negative things about the women and who was, putting them down and calling them names and accusing them of things that they didn't do. And it really makes the women, it makes it easier for Congress to deny them. And that's exactly what they do in June of 1944, right after the invasion of D-Day, right as people are being hopeful that the war might be won, and maybe we don't need these women after all. And I often think of the WASP as kind of the canary in the coal mine, if you will, for all those Rosie the Riveters, right? They are the first group that is kind of set aside because you can't have women taking the men's jobs. You can have women helping and releasing men, but you can't have women getting in the way of men who are available to do the jobs. And so that really is part of what happens.
Or at least the case that was made by them
Mm-hmm.
at that time.
Exactly.
Yeah. So this program that sent all these planes rolling off the factory floor, getting ferried to points of embarkation, forced to deactivate as the war was turning in the Allies' favor, as you mentioned. Yeah, it's the devastation for all of these women that had flown all of those miles. And you looked through a lot of different sources for your research, obviously, letters, diaries, official announcements, and records from these points where they were, the bases and the training camps where they were. What kind of reactions did you find to this decision in your research?
Right. And my favorite source that I used was the oral histories, where I got to actually spend time with these women and talk to them. And so many of them were so disappointed, and many of them were embarrassed because the war was going on. They'd been told they were doing a good job, whether it was the ferrying or towing targets to train gunners on the ground, or all sorts of jobs that had to be done. And they'd been told that they were doing their part and that they were making a difference in the war effort. And then in December of 1944, they were sent home, and it was right in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. If you think about the timing, they're dismissed on December 20th, which is right in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, when the United States is like, wait a minute, maybe we're not going to win today. And it was embarrassing for them to go home, and quite devastating for them to go home and not have finished the war with their help.
Hey, also, they'd seen so much of the world by then relative to the people who lived in their own hometowns and
Mhm.
built this camaraderie. I'm going to try and integrate a couple questions because I think they go
Sure.
together. Laura says, one of the former pilots attended my church. She never seemed like the stereotypical housewife of the generation. How did these women reintegrate into post-war life? And Jack says, did any of these pilots find careers in any kind of commercial aviation after the war? So can you talk a little bit about what happened to them after deactivation?
Sure, and I'll be honest, that's one of my favorite parts of the book. is I was always interested in that, the rest of the story, kind of the Paul Harvey kind of idea of, well, what happened next, right? And so that's a big part of my study is how did they integrate? How did they come back? And many of them wanted to continue flying. They felt guilty because they had all this flight training and experience. So while the war was still ongoing, they worked for different companies that flew old airplanes to the boneyards and got them put away. Some of them went to work for the Army Air Forces as tower operators and different things like that. But after the war, the airlines were not an option for women. The airlines had thousands of pilots coming back from the war who had lots of qualifications. They could pick whoever they wanted to be a pilot for the airline, and they didn't pick women. They had no reason to do it. But a lot of these women did continue to fly. They flew as flight instructors. Several of them opened their own fixed base operation where they did different commercial flights for people, flew people from place to place and sold gas and that kind of thing. Several women went into air shows and did stunt flying and different things like that. But by the 1960s, this was a lot harder to do, and especially the 1970s as the economy kind of tanks nationwide. But the women are trying to keep flying. Of course, a lot of them get married and have children. Those of you in the audience that know about flying, it's an expensive hobby, and you have to keep it up. And so once they started settling down into other careers or families, they stopped flying, but they always looked up to the sky.
Hmm. Uh, we know a lot about many, let's say stereotypical men who served in World War II have a difficulty, or any sort of battle experience, difficulty talking about their experience. Patricia asks, in your experience, what do you think the personal impact was on some or any of the women during the war and being unable to continue to fly? I think you've talked about that a little, but how did that make them feel about themselves and their contributions? And did many of them talk about it to others when they got home? They really created quite a network.
Right. I think this is a great question. So the women did keep together. They started an organization in the fall of 1944 as they knew they were going to be disbanded. They called it the Order of Fifanella, which this is Fifanella, right? She was their mascot from Walt Disney. Roald Dahl wrote a book, and she came out of it. And they wanted to help each other find jobs and just stay together. So this organization of them stayed together through 1951 or so until it kind of fell apart. And then it gets back together again in the 1964, all the way through, just not that long ago when they dissolved. But the idea of who to talk to about it, a couple of the women that I talked to, Marty Weil, who's kind of a main character in the book, and Carol Bosca, who's pictured in the book, they both talked to me one evening about, they didn't talk about it. Their kids didn't know anything about it, and Marty, one of my favorite stories of Marty is, have you ever sat at a table with 5 little children? You don't talk about what mother did during the war. You talk about, why did you hit John in the head with that big brick? You move on, and it's not about mother. So a lot of their kids didn't know that their mothers had done this until they were teenagers or even out of high school. So some of it's they were just busy. Carol Bailey Bosca used to talk about, she never told her friends who she played bridge with about it because they wouldn't be interested. They'd be like, oh, and move on. So it was really when these women came together that they were able to talk about the flying they'd done and have this in common with each other and have a lot of fun about it.
And they also became organized politically. I mean, this is in the 1960s, there were two different runs at trying to revive, or let's say, reorganize those attempts to the cause for the WASP to be admitted to or be awarded status and the benefits as military veterans, not just
Mhm.
reservist, which was the status they had. This is a campaign that's especially interesting in the 1970s. There are a couple different runs. 1960s, which, interestingly enough, Barry Goldwater is one of their champions. I'll let readers just read about that. But then again in 1972, sponsored by Lindy Boggs, a Democrat from Louisiana, Margaret Heckler, a Republican from Massachusetts, they take another run. But what's interesting here is that this is around the same time that the Equal Rights Amendment is being pushed or being pushed through states. But
Mhm.
the women here, the WASPs, they were careful to distance themselves from the quote unquote women's libbers. So what was that about? Was that strategic?
Yes, it was completely strategic. Throughout the 1970s, as the WASP fight to be recognized as veterans, uh, you know, it did coalesce with the women's movement, and they were very careful. They wanted the support, and they supported the growing rights and opportunities for women, particularly women who were serving as new pilots in the armed forces starting in 1973 and 1974, 5, and 6, the different services started allowing women. And the WASP supported that wholly and were so excited for those opportunities. But they also were very aware, they had learned their lesson in 1944 of image does make a difference. And in 1970s, now they were where in the 40s, their opponents had portrayed them as selfish vixens out to take the men's jobs. In the 1970s, they were spunky grandmas, who had done their part in the war. And so they were careful in the image that they portrayed. It was an incredible grassroots organization, a grassroots effort to be recognized, but they were very savvy about it. Several of them were in public relations for a living and used those skills, and they were very careful and very smart about the way they promoted their own story and helped shape it for the public to consume.
Carol asked, was any of their silence because of security issues? So maybe they weren't allowed to talk about what they had done. Is that germane at all?
Nope.
No.
There were maybe a couple who the jobs that they did were top secret or classified for some time, but for most of them, it wasn't about that. There's a lot of stories that go about, and I've even seen some documentaries that say that they were declared secret and they were classified and their files were hidden away for decades. And that's just not true. I've got reports that were declassified in 1951. There were official reports that were done. There were stories that were done in the by the Army Air Forces and the Air Force proper. The reality is that the WASP were forgotten, which I think is much worse than the idea of them being hidden. They were forgotten for decades, and I think our job is to remember them and the work that they did during the war.
Well, that's been your story. This has been a long road to tell this story for you, whose love for flying was sealed also in a ride in a crop duster, I guess, not a barn stover, in the Midwest. Now, this was after I guess it was some sort of aviation gathering that you actually met one of the WASP that got you started. Can you tell us that story and why meeting it with her was so consequential for you?
Yeah, that was 1993. It was a very long time ago, and I was teaching. I had a bachelor's in history and was teaching at Spartan School of Aeronautics there in Tulsa. I was teaching history and government for them, and I went up to an air show in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and went up. It was a biplane expo, and went up to meet Curtis Pitts, who was the great aircraft designer of the Pitts Special. And he was very kind and chatted with me and turned and introduced me, and said, "This is Carol Bailey Bosca. She flew my second airplane and was the 1951 aerobatic champion." It just blew my mind. I'd never realized women had done this. And then after talking to them for a while, Carol revealed that she'd flown B-25s in World War II. What? And so that was the moment in time that's very specific June day that I learned a little bit about the WASP and couldn't believe that I'd never heard of them, and went back to Tulsa, and everybody I talked to had never heard of them. And how is this possible? These women flew all these planes during the war. So I kind of set myself a mission to learn everything I could and then to share their story. And I met Carol again. She was kind enough to give me her address, and I wrote back to her in 1996 after I'd started graduate school and done some more research, and I started my oral histories that summer. So yeah, it's been a long road. I've done a lot of things, documentary films and a Rose Parade float and all sorts of things, but I'm very happy to have the book out. But the greatest joy of all of this long mission of mine, I guess, is I got to know so many of these women. I got to spend so much time. I'd see them 3 or 4 times a year, and it's been a hard few years as we've lost them. But boy, how lucky have I been to have gotten to know them so well.
Actually, how many you mentioned 38 WASP killed between 1942 and 1944 when the program was running. Many have died since. How many are still with us?
We're fewer than 30.
Oh my goodness.
Fewer than 30. They're all in their late 90s, but there are several who, I was did a talk for Powell's bookstore, just a few weeks ago, and
In Portland.
Nell Bright joined me. Yeah, Nell Bright joined me, and zoomed in, from her location. So I think, several of them are doing very well, and Nell is 99 years old and fabulous. So I've been very lucky to have these women in my life for so long.
Quickly, a question that I didn't get to, and I'm curious about, did France, Germany, and the Soviet Union and Italy have women pilots also during World War II? You
Well, the
mentioned
Soviet Union, of course, did. France did not, because France was just defeated so quickly. They did not. Germany had a few female test pilots, but didn't utilize them in this way. One area that did have women pilots was England. They had an auxiliary of the Royal Air Force, was called the Air Transport Auxiliary. And these were pilots who weren't qualified to be combat pilots, who couldn't do it, but they had women as part of it. Women were a small part of the Air Transport Auxiliary, and they ferried planes across England, and then once the coast was secured, actually flew them all the way to France. And there were actually several American women who served in the Air Transport Auxiliary as well.
including Jackie Cochran. Didn't she train them?
Yes, Jackie took the first group over there.
Okay, so now this this book has been optioned for a film
It
by,
has.
by Hamilton director Thomas Kail.
Mhm.
Um, the remaining WASPs, since their flying days are over, this book is out, their story is being told. What does it mean to restore this history right now at this time?
For me,
Yeah.
it means everything. It's a promise that I made a long time ago, and they trusted me with their stories. And I feel a great weight of responsibility to share their stories and share them widely. I think they're so inspiring in their independence of spirit and their ideas of it's okay to be the only one in the room who wants to do something. You still follow your own truth and take that opportunity and do it. And it doesn't matter if the people around you think you're odd, go and do it. And you'll find your people. And that's what the WASP did. And while I hope everyone learns to fly, I really hope, and the WASP hoped as well, that everyone will follow their own star and make the most of their own lives.
Karen Landdeck, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you, everybody.
The name of the book is The Women with Silver Wings, the inspiring true story of the the woman Air Force service pilots, WASP, of World War II. Please do purchase it. We encourage you to purchase it at Acapella Books to support an independent bookstore. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. There are plenty more virtual author talks coming up. Next Monday, a conversation with two great Southern storytellers, George Singleton and Ron Rash, will be speaking with each other. On Tuesday evening, that's September 22nd, Robert Jones is going to be talking with me about his book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Lays out evidence that in his analysis, deeply racist attitudes have been embedded in the DNA of white Christian identity over time. So that should be a very interesting conversation. And on Thursday, that's on the 24th, Michael Ian Black joins Stuff You Should Know co-host Chuck Bryant to talk about A Better Man, a mostly serious letter to my son. You can look at the full schedule and Zoom links at atlantahistorycenter.com. Thank you again so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.